Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey Adapters, welcome back to an exciting episode. I went to the recent Innovations in Climate Resilience Conference, or ICR24, in Washington, D.C., hosted by Battelle. It's my second time covering this conference, and it was fantastic. The event was held in the Ronald Reagan Federal Building in the heart of D.C. Battelle recruited an all-star lineup from the public and private sector. This year's theme was Solutions for Scaling Change, focusing on the urgency and the growing need for innovations at scale to meet the monumental task of addressing climate change. The interviews in this episode are a combination of the ones I did at the conference and interviews that I did soon after. Some of the experts were keynote speakers at the event, and others did poster and speaking presentations throughout the conference. I was definitely inspired by attending the conference, and once again, hats off to Battelle for keeping the issue of climate adaptation and resilience front and center, and also attracting senior people in the federal government and an emerging group of climate innovators in the private sector. I also was encouraged to hear the tech and finance sector coming into adaptation in a big way, and you'll hear more about that in this episode. Thanks to Battelle for bringing me in to cover this event. We're going to kick off this episode with Matt Vaughn of Battelle, who's going to set the stage of what ICR24 is all about and some of the highlights from the conference. You're going to enjoy these conversations as much as I did. Hey Adapters, joining me is Matt Vaughn. Matt is the president of Applied Science and Technology at Battelle. Hi Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Doug, great to be here. Thank you.
All right, Matt. So I've had this great partnership with Battelle, but just if someone's a new listener here, can you give us that overview? What is Battelle?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Battelle is the world's largest independent nonprofit research and development organization. We've been around for 95 years, and our mission is to help translate technology from the bench to industry for the betterment of humanity. And what makes us a nonprofit is not that we seek donations, rather that we give away any of our proceeds to try to make the world a better place. In particular, we focus on STEM education. It's a great place to work. We've got thousands of researchers, engineers, and scientists working on things that we believe will help make the world a better place for generations to come.
I've done multiple episodes with you guys, but I still feel like I learned something new about what Battelle does. You guys are a big organization doing a lot of great work. But can you just tell us a little bit about your specific role there?
Sure. I head up the Applied Science and Technology group at Battelle, which is the thing that's been here for 95 years. And we're about $1 billion organization with 3,000 folks, the majority of whom are technical. And we work in technologies that will make an impact in health, environment, and security. And we're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, but we have labs and facilities across the U.S.
Let's pivot and talk about ICR24, Innovations in Climate Resilience. And so we're doing this interview post-conference. It was a fantastic event. Congratulations on the event. I really had a fantastic time. You guys recruited some real all-stars, but maybe just in hindsight, can you just describe where was it? What was the purpose?
We started ICR 3 years ago because we recognized that there was probably a gap in the conversation about climate resilience. And we wanted to be the folks who helped convene the conversation around all the sciences and all the industries and all the policy and all the regulation that will be necessary to bring us to a place with a cleaner planet and a better environment for folks to grow up in. So with that in mind, we started this conference in Columbus 2 years ago. We moved it to DC in the Reagan Center this year, and it was a really great decision, very impactful conference. We were able to attract an amazing set of speakers from industry and government. And particularly this year, we brought finance in too, because of course, the changes that we're talking about making as a society include pretty substantial investments. The government's done a great job in the last 2 years of priming the pump, but to get to the fully resilient environment and climate, we're obviously going to need to have finance there too. So that was a great add to this year's conference, and we're looking forward to another great one next year in 25.
And can you tell us just a little bit about your partnership with the Wilson Center?
Yeah, the Wilson Center, as Doug, is a wonderful nonprofit in DC that does a great job in bringing the policy part to the conversation, which they did this year, bringing together a number of panels to discuss all the aspects of the policymaking and policy impact on technology and on industry. And they were wonderful partners in helping us with this conference, as were the national labs who helped sponsor the event as well.
So there were three major themes to this year's conference.
There were. And one of them is particularly near and dear to your heart, as I know. Yeah. So this year we chose to put swim lanes around the conversations, and starting with adaptation, mitigation, and sustainability. And I know you've got a particular love and focus. And so I imagine we're about to dig in.
First off, I just wanted to, I know you can't list them all. Can you give us some highlights of the keynote speakers? Really just, as you'd mentioned, just some all-stars there in government and the private sector. And I was just amazed. I got to meet some of these people. They'd come off stage and I talked to them and have a couple of those interviews for this episode too. But can you give us some highlights of some of the people that you recruited to speak?
Absolutely. Ali Zaidi came and gave the keynote. And as he's a national climate advisor, and really amazing speech, as all of our talks were. He spoke without notes. He spoke with high energy and great passion and really pulled the whole of the conference together. We had great representation from DOE. Dr. Jerry Richmond came from the Undersecretary for Science and Technology, gave a wonderful speech about all that DOE is doing. And we had Kelly Cummings, who leads the new OSED at DOD, which is spending a lot of the resources to bring these collaborative public-private partnerships forward to fund large-scale transition programs in hydrogen and direct air capture and other things. Great speakers. We had a really unique panel from DOD with the folks who represent the facilities and environment side of things, Brendan Owens at OSD, and then representatives from Air Force, Navy, and Army, all spoke in an hour-plus long panel that brought a lot of excitement around the areas of technology that they're looking to have brought forward. Just a broad range of speakers and great panels.
I want to applaud you guys too, is like some of the speakers, the way it's set up, if we were in the main hall, that most of the time there was time for questions from the audience. And again, these are very high level people. Normally you don't get a chance to chat with them. And so just you guys were able to set that up and the people from the audience were able to ask questions to these policymakers. So I think that was a really great thing that you guys did.
I appreciate that, Doug. I actually think it was really the format and the content that people were interested in. Folks came forward with great questions. And I think these leaders in government are really looking for input. They're looking to hear from innovators and policymakers. And they were really excited for these conversations.
What stood out about you for me is that I saw you in the hallways all the time talking to a bunch of different people. Were there any conversations that really stood out for you? What really resonated for you talking to different people that were attending?
Probably the most interesting thing that stood out for me was this young high school student who was our awardee and honoree for her project and research that she's doing in the littoral or ocean change mitigation that she's working on, came forward with a remarkable project. I think we probably should have put her up as a speaker, to be honest with you. But across the whole of the conference, there was just an amazing mix of academia, policy, industry, and as I said, finance. And to have all of that in one place is exactly what we're looking for, a mixing bowl where all the ideas can come together. We worry that things get stovepiped so often in industry and academia and in policy. And our whole intent is to bring that mixing bowl together so that folks can know what other folks are doing and find that spark of connection and innovation that may lead to the next big breakthrough. So it was really exciting to be in that hall with so many bright minds from these different areas that don't often get to talk together.
That high school student will be on later in this episode. It was an amazing interview. My jaw was dropping on just how poised she was and just how confident in what she wants to do with her life. So stay tuned for that. She was amazing. You guys, if you've selected a very well-deserving person. I was wandering those hallways quite a bit. I did some interviews there, and what I just want to give you some feedback too, and you said, let's talk about adaptation, is that there were a lot of those people there and they appreciated that Battelle, this is your third year doing it. Resilience and adaptation is a focus. And there's not a lot of people out there, a lot of organizations and companies focusing it at a conference level. And they were just very appreciative that resilience and adaptation was one of your main focuses of that.
And I'm glad that people found that. And I hope that next year, even more people come to the conference to experience kind of the collective totality of what's in front of us. While on one hand, it's really daunting to know that we've got a long ways to go and maybe not as much time as we'd all like to get there. It's really exciting, though, to know that we have a whole set of tools in our toolbox to come together and make this planet livable and also economically viable. And I'm really passionate about that, finding the things and the tools in our toolbox that let us do both. Have a great environment, have a clean and healthy planet, an ecosystem that is here for forever, frankly, and at the same time continue to have economic prosperity and justice and equality through resources. And that requires us to work in industrious ways in industry and with industry to bring great science forward and make the changes that we need. And it's not just about one science, one technology, one industry. Yes, we're going to have some things that change and we're going to have to adapt to them. We've definitely got to mitigate some of the impacts that we're having, and we have to get to a sustainable future. All three of those directions are necessary.
I saw a lot of great presentations there, and I go to a lot of adaptation conferences and events and webinars, and it's my whole area. But I was really surprised by some of the new information and new energy in this space. And I want to highlight specifically, there was a panel hosted on the main stage by Tailwind on finance and emerging adaptation technology. And you highlighted them in your original notes. And I just want to tell you that, first off, everyone there looked like they were 35 or younger, all like leading in this finance and tech space. And I was just blown away by this energy and like, where have these people been? And they are all in on helping the finance side of adaptation. And so you did make a little note of Tailwind in your opening remarks. And I just want to give you some feedback. That was just a remarkable panel.
Absolutely. And it's great to see Tailwind's moving in as a leader and an early mover in the early stage venture side that will be necessary. I think that the movement of venture funding from the digital world that has really transformed a lot of our day-to-day life over the last 20 years into sort of the more physical sciences. We see it in biotech. Now we're seeing it in clean tech and in adaptation technology. And Tailwinds deserves a lot of credit for seeing that opportunity and leading into it. We think that this finance stream, will be ever more important. There's probably a whole ecosystem of finance people who didn't come to this conference, who will come next year. And Tailwinds deserves a ton of credit for being a trailblazer.
What's the word on ICR25? Can we expect, hopefully you guys are coming back next year?
You can absolutely expect we're coming back. We're going to be at the Reagan Center in DC again. We thought the venue was excellent. We loved the participation. Count on us being there in 25. Count on the conference being even bigger and adding probably some more work on the regulatory side. We think we saw that there's a real hunger for the community to interface and interact with regulators. So we're looking to bring them into the conversation next year.
Matt, thanks for coming on. Thanks to Battelle for partnering with America Adapts. And I hope to see you guys next year at ICR25. It's always a treat to work with Battelle.
Doug, thanks for all you do in America Adapts and covering the space and bringing the conversations to the fore. Your voice is a leadership voice at the pioneering edge of these conversations. And you do an amazing job, and we're grateful for you covering the conference and working with Battelle.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
All right, Doug, thanks.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Rick Spinrad. Dr. Spinrad is the administrator of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Hi, Dr. Spinrad. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Glad to be.
It is a real privilege to have the head of NOAA here on the podcast. I have a lot of listeners at NOAA, and just thanks again for coming on. Let's just start and ground some of my listeners that aren't familiar with NOAA. Who are you guys? What is generally overall your mission?
Yeah, so NOAA, we reside within the Department of Commerce. As the name implies, we really are responsible for collecting information, developing forecasts. Effectively, what I like to describe our role as is the federal government's environmental intelligence agency. So we have a responsibility for weather, climate, oceans. We also manage the nation's marine fisheries. We have a stewardship responsibility in terms of managing and designating marine protected areas. But our portfolio actually extends well beyond the atmosphere. We're responsible for the nation's space weather prediction system, for example, too. So it's really all about the environment and providing those products and services that American individuals, industries, and communities need for what I like to say is improving their lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles.
This is part of the Innovations in Climate Resilience episode, and you came and you spoke. This is we're doing this interview after the conference itself. I'm going to ask you some questions about some of the adaptation work that you're doing, but more broadly, NOAA is just knee deep in the issue of adaptation, right?
Absolutely. It's part and parcel of just about everything that we do.
What are some of the climate mapping related to adaptation that NOAA provides? Can you give us some of those examples?
Yeah, I think the best way to start is to think about what it is that people need for resilience and adaptation. And so a lot of what we do is tied to understanding the common climate-related hazards. Think of flooding, heat impacts, drought, wildfire, coastal resilience, including things like sea level rise. So We obviously conduct the research and engage in the science along with our partners in other federal agencies and with our collaborators, especially in the academic community. And then we put products out. One example would be what we call CAMRA, the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation portal. That is, and if your listeners want to go there, it's just simply resilience.climate.gov. That's the place to go to get things like real-time maps at a resolution that is at the census tract level. For a typical medium-sized city, there may be 20 or 30 census tracts. That gives you a sense of the sort of granularity and gives people access to information about knowing how vulnerable are we to some of these climate-related hazards. But it also gives people the tools they can get to find out, are there federal programs to help us become more resilient, to engage in projects, to protect us from things like sea level rise, that sort of thing. So CAMRA is probably one of the most important tools that we've developed related to adaptation and resilience, and it's right there for people to use. And we're going to be constantly upgrading and improving.
Just some feedback. In a previous life, I was doing adaptation planning for 20 years, and I have used NOAA sea level rise maps throughout my professional experiences. And so I just want to say that you guys have obviously been putting out some top-notch information for a long time.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, appreciate it. And that's a really good example of one that we've been delivering for decades, and delighted to hear that it was so useful for you.
At the conference, you also mentioned, and this is hopefully going to get a lot more attention because it's the number one killer when you think of climate impacts, but you have this heat risk tool. What's that?
Yeah, so this is a really important tool, especially as we're coming into the summer for what could be a particularly hot summer. Last year was the hottest year on record. This year is showing signs of being the same. So we realize that it's one thing to put out the kind of weather related physical information. What's the temperature going to be in my neighborhood this week and for the next 6 or 7 days? It's another thing to translate that into impacts for my health. So we realize the expertise for the health side of it is with the federal government organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. So we worked together with CDC to develop this heat risk tool. It's based on the best available science for understanding the physical forecast for heat and the CDC heat health data so that people can go in there and get a sense of how vulnerable they're going to be. Think of this in the sense that the heat event that may occur in Miami is going to be different, even though it may be the same temperature as it would be in Phoenix or Milwaukee. That same heat event in a neighborhood where there's not a lot of access to cooling centers is going to be more impactful than another neighborhood. So this combines the weather-related expertise that we bring to the table and then the health-related expertise that our colleagues at CDC bring to the table for a really useful tool, we hope, especially for some of the more sensitive and vulnerable groups in the population.
I don't know if you caught, but I'm actually based in Tucson, Arizona. So heat obviously is a major issue. And when I talk to my friends back east, they don't quite get when they see our temperatures are like 108. It's obviously hot with the humidity and everything. And so like heat planning is certainly different in different parts of the country.
Absolutely. And Tucson's a really good example because I think people are expecting that in Tucson. But what we have seen is that it's when it's unexpected or when you're not prepared, that's where the impacts can be really significant. And it's interesting, we're doing this interview in the early part of May, and right here in DC, we're starting to see temperatures in the upper 80s and low 90s in late April, early May. So being prepared for that, getting the information you need, and knowing what to do as a consequence is really what this tool is intended to address.
One of the parts of your presentation that I really enjoyed, and I know you can't share all the examples, but partnerships are a big part of how you do your job. And I even saw the Patent and Trade Office is one of your partners. Could you maybe elaborate on one or two of those?
Yeah, this is a really exciting development for us at NOAA. So when I came into the position, and I think some of your audience knows, I actually was a career scientist with NOAA for many years before I came into this political appointment as the administrator. So I already knew something about the opportunities for partnering across federal agencies. And in fact, it turns out that the Patent and Trademark Office, we call it PTO, is one of our sister bureaus within the Department of Commerce. So I knew we had access to that office and could engage in some early discussions. But the other interesting thing that's happened is that we're seeing a lot of innovation and technology development and especially new development of intellectual property in the climate space. There are a lot of startups who are providing tailored products and services, forecasts. They're looking at providing information to specific sectors, think energy or agriculture or transportation. However, the ability to succeed as a business sometimes depends on protecting your intellectual property. You may have developed a new predictive model for heat health, as we were talking about, and you want to be able to protect that intellectual property, build your business, and also rely on partnering with the federal agencies. The Patent and Trademark Office and we started talking, and the gist of the conversation was that PTO realized their patent examiners were being presented with a number of these really cool ideas for intellectual property in the climate arena, but the examiners didn't necessarily have expertise in climate. Similarly, we started seeing at NOAA all of these new businesses developing, and we didn't really have an understanding of what constitutes protectable intellectual property. The marriage that emerged between us and PTO in the form of a formal agreement allows their patent examiners at PTO to work with our climate experts, climate science experts, and also allows our climate science experts to understand what constitutes protectable intellectual property for this burgeoning economic sector. Don't forget, NOAA sits within the Department of Commerce. So part of our mission is to support economic development. And this partnership with PTO has really been extraordinary in terms of building new capabilities for American economic development.
All right, that's fantastic. Okay, so bear with me on this question. Increasingly on my podcast, climate data and climate modeling, there's a huge demand for it. You think it's this wonky subject, but my listeners can't get enough of this. And we recognize the tremendous value of public weather and climate services. So there's this proliferation of climate services and private climate services, and they're doing really interesting things with research and development. But some of these private firms' approaches raise questions about their scientific credibility and how much the public really gains from these data services going private. So I guess my question to you, though, is NOAA and a few other agencies generate all this public information that adaptation planners want to use, but there's all these private firms coming online, and a lot of the end users aren't quite sure how to maneuver. How are you at NOAA thinking about that? You must recognize these services. And in some ways, it's a really good thing, but in other ways, the people in the public aren't quite sure, is this a good product?
Yeah, I think it's a really timely and important issue. And the first thing is we obviously want to foster this economic development. I'm actually delighted to see this burgeoning commercial sector. By some estimates, incidentally, the commercial climate services sector could be anywhere from a $100 billion to $1 trillion agency. So it's incumbent on us as, again, a part of the Department of Commerce to foster the development. But as with any growing industry, you want to make sure that the quality products are there. And that's as true for us at NOAA as it is for the private sector services. So I think the important point for users to recognize is any of these services have to be founded on strong, fundamental, best available science, which means that the principles of scientific integrity have got to be baked in. So I would tell users, potential users, take a look at the services that are being offered and ask questions about, have these services been subjected to the standards of peer review? That's the gold standard for science. If I'm going to put out a new idea or build a new model, predictive capability, one of the first things I, as a scientist, I'm going to want to do is get it peer reviewed and make sure that it has, if you will, suffered the scrutiny of the scientific community. The other thing is, how open are the data? How open is the science? You really don't necessarily want a black box approach. You ought to be able to a certain degree, understand how this product has been built. Now, that's where that intellectual property piece comes in, because the business wants to make sure they can protect that intellectual property. So not everything is necessarily going to be fully and openly disclosed, but at the very least, you ought to be able to get a sense of what was behind the physics of the model that went into the predictive system. So asking questions about that nature, and that's tied to the peer review element, are really important things to do. And then the accessibility, just how easy is it to get into the products and services and analyze them. A lot of users just want to know, hey, what's going to happen to sea level in my county in 20 years? That's fine, but being able to ask, how does this compare with other analyses? Why is this one better? The bottom line is ask questions about how the product was developed and what's the foundational science behind it.
All right. And I am in total agreement. I think it's very exciting with a lot of these companies coming online, but here's some feedback for you. And I know this comes with its own sort of issues. It's just helping a lot of those groups navigate it. If there's trainings, if there's things like that, how do you select these kind of things? And there's obviously issues associated with that. But I just think providing people with that baseline ability to do what you just said that they should do would be incredibly helpful.
I agree. And if I can come back to the original question, what I would say, Doug, is that tools like camera, the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation, yes, they obviously include the geographic information. Hey, I want to go to my neighborhood and see what's going on here. But they also include access to foundational information. Where do I find out more about the science of resilience, more about the science of adaptation? And so there are links there to the scientific literature. A good user will say, okay, if I'm going to start, you use the example of sea level rise. If I'm going to use these tools, these sea level rise tools, is there a literature search that I can conduct? Can I go look in the scientific literature to understand this? And then the other thing is, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of really good subject matter experts in the federal government, and we are accessible to the public. If the public has questions about where do I find out more about the science of seasonal forecasting for precipitation, start first with some of the portals like Camera. Use the access you've got there and ask a lot of questions.
You brought up Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. So what point were you trying to make by bringing up that book?
Yeah, that book was recommended to me years ago as an interesting study of the world response to climate change. And basically what Robinson did in this piece of fiction, and I want to make sure the listeners understand it is a fictional work, was the concept of what has been called geoengineering or climate intervention. And basically, the premise of the book is that a nation decides that they are going to unilaterally engage in what we would call solar radiation management, and influencing how much sunlight, how much solar radiation actually hits the surface of the Earth in order to reduce the temperature and reduce the solar radiation heating of the Earth. And I bring it up because when it was written, it was very much a fictional concept. Nobody really thought that this might actually be something that happens. And quite honestly, now we're at a stage with respect to climate intervention where we are having serious discussions about things like solar radiation management, carbon dioxide removal. And I think it's important for the public to understand, first of all, what are the threats? What are the challenges? Why is this even a discussion? And second of all, what's the art of the possible? So if you read that book, you start asking questions like, can we even do that? Does that technology exist right now? Should we do it? What's the nature of international agreements that would control or regulate processes like that? So it's an eye-opener written in a fictional style. So it's not like pulling up a textbook on climate change and atmospheric physics. And I think readers would get something out of seeing this perspective on what is a very timely issue for us.
It has its own genre now. It's climate fiction. They call it Cli-Fi. I've covered it a bit on the podcast.
There you go.
So,
yeah.
Right. So I have a lot of young listeners and young professionals who want to get into the adaptation sector. Any advice for them seeing NOAA as a future employer?
Yeah. So my basic advice is just do it. Just start asking questions, figuring out what's out there. Take a look at some of the sort of portals and websites I've seen. Adaptation is something that can be done. It can be scaled. Yes, adaptation needs to be addressed on a national level and global level. But even in your community, what are the challenges? What are the threats? Maybe that's the first thing. Go to a site like Camera, find out what are the threats? What is your community challenged by? Are you going to face extreme heat? Do you have threats of drought or flooding in your neighborhood? And then start bringing it up in discussions. Ask at school. Are there things that ought to be included in the curriculum? And there are some formal activities to engage in as well. We've got a program we just started here at NOAA called the Young Changemakers Fellowship, where we're trying to bring high school students in to understand how policies are developed around climate change. And other agencies have similar programs. So coming right back to where I started, just do it. Get engaged, learn about your neighborhood, ask questions.
I think we're all still learning about it, but the Climate Corps is coming out. And would NOAA house any of them? Have you heard anything about that?
So we've done a number of things. Climate Corps, we have programs that contribute in terms of workforce development. We also are using some of the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act to develop what we're calling a climate-ready workforce. We'll be spending up to $60 million to help facilitate building out a core of what I would call our climate-ready professionals, people who understand the science and the policy aspects of adaptation and resilience. And so you'll be seeing some announcements about those programs. Those programs are targeted to provide resources to the organizations and individuals who will actually set up the programs. And so watch this space. We'll make that announcement sometime in the next couple of months. And those should be opportunities for young people to actually become part of this climate-ready workforce.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Spinnrad, for coming on the podcast. It was a huge honor to have you come on. Appreciate all what you're doing there.
It's my pleasure. And right back at you. Thank you for paying attention and putting a focus on these important issues.
Hey, Adapters. I'm with Dina Esposito, Assistant to the Administrator, Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security at USAID. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us broadly what your office does?
So I lead the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security at USAID. And for your listeners who don't know, AID is actually the largest bilateral relief and development agency in the world, working in about 100 countries on major issues of development, hunger, poverty, malnutrition, conflict, governance, and more. My office is bringing together It's a new office. It's a new bureau, bringing together our food security, our water security, our resilience, and other sectoral teams with our climate and biodiversity teams, recognizing that we cannot solve the global hunger crisis, the global water crisis without integrating this climate agenda. And we cannot solve the climate agenda without looking at how these sectoral interventions are affecting of climate.
We're doing this interview post the presentation that you give, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. So you discussed the need to bring ingenuity and urgency that we're seeing here in the U.S. to address climate challenges abroad. Can you expand on this?
So at AID, we think about resilience as the ability of people, nations, and systems to cope, adapt, and even thrive in spite of a changing climate. And what we're seeing is that people are struggling more and more. I mentioned that I started my career as a disaster relief officer in the Horn of Africa, working on the Somalia famine response of 91-92. It used to be you saw droughts there every decade, then it was every 5 to 7 years, now it's closer to every 2 to 3. And the humanitarian and human fallout is extraordinary, right? We saw 20 million people in need of life-saving food assistance. But it goes well beyond hunger. If you talk to our health colleagues, they'll talk to you about needing to use AI to get ahead of where malaria outbreaks will be because of more hot and wet weather. You'll talk to the Aggies who will tell you that there's more crop disease and pests that they have to worry about. Even education outcomes are being reversed, and there are problems with increasing malnutrition. So the entire development agenda requires a call to action, and that means investment. It means ingenuity. It means partnerships, new partnerships around the world to really accelerate the pace of change.
Okay, so you're elaborating on that, but could you get more specific? And so what changes or shifts at USAID that have you made to meet this moment?
So in 2022, we launched a new climate strategy. It used to be we would talk about our work as very much focused on things like renewable energy, of course, conserving of tropical forests. But now we talk about the climate agenda as running through the entire portfolio. And we ask every operating unit to really speak to how they're helping mitigate risk and help farm communities adapt to the crisis that we see. We've set some really ambitious targets, not only around carbon sequestration, but also we're committed to helping 500 million people adapt to a changing climate in the next 10 years. Restoring or conserving 100 million hectares of land and helping to mobilize $150 billion in finance. We also have embarked on this reorganization that I spoke to you about, recognizing that we need to break down these stovepipes if we're going to create win-win solutions for people and planet.
Okay, let's talk about some of the goals that you mentioned in your speech, and specifically information. What did you mean by that?
So one of the central agendas we have is increasing access to information for communities. We're all affected by climate and weather-related disasters, but literally 1/3 of the world's population has no access to early warning weather advisories. And fully 60% of the people on the African continent don't have access. We're working hard to scale that access. An example that I gave today was working with the government of Bangladesh, where with NASA, with the government, with local communities and regional governments, we helped in 2022 250,000 farmers get access to weather advisories that were very location specific. This helped them to save roughly $470 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have an income of less than $3,000 a year, you're talking about the difference potentially between extreme poverty and losing your entire livelihood and not. Super important work. Whenever we do our access to information work, we're always thinking about who benefits, right? We know that women are disproportionately impacted by climate shocks and economic shocks. And we know that if we aren't very intentional about the way we design, we need to think about who has access to the radio or the cell phone. We need to think about how we communicate, what language, what time the advisory goes out, and where the location are, for example, for materials distribution. So if we don't design with and for those communities intentionally, we don't think that we're going to have the kind of sustainable impact that we want to have and the equitable climate resilient growth that we're really committed to engendering.
You talked about innovation and research as a major focus of your effort to address climate change. And so why is this important?
Well, I come from the food security background, so if I'd like to focus in that area, Feed the Future is the U.S. government's global hunger initiative. It's focused on not only increasing equitable growth in the agri-food system area, but creating a more resilient food system and improving nutrition for women and girls. And one of the really central features of it is deep investments in research. We spend about 60% of those resources on crop research, so improving yields and pest and climate resilience of fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes. We work a lot on improved production practices. We work on livestock and fish production, improved genetics and more. And we are actually focusing more on food loss and waste and food fortification, which in a climate changing world where it's getting harder to grow food, more people are consuming processed foods. These are new areas of investment for research that we think are really timely and really important. That research really is delivered through 70 different institutions in the United States across 42 states, and it is also done in partnership with national agricultural research institutions, really helping to develop their capacity to identify and resolve these critical challenges. Some of the successes that I would just mention was that we were really instrumental in partnership with others in getting drought-resilient maize or corn scaled across 18 million acres in East and Southern Africa. That drought-resilient maize is 40% more productive than regular corn varieties during times of drought. And we estimate that intervention alone was adding $1 billion into the economies across Africa that year. We also have developed heat-tolerant hybrid corn. We're investing in reducing methane emissions from livestock by changing their diets. We're helping farmers, many of whom are women, with improved rice varieties and changing their production practices so that it saves them time, it increases productivity, and it reduces methane emissions. So again, always looking for these kind of triple or double and triple wins for both people and planet.
We've gone through these I's here: information, innovation. This final one is investment. How is USAID working to crowd in investment for climate resilience?
So whether you're talking about the climate space or the agriculture space or the water security space, what you're seeing across the board is USAID increasingly trying to use its resources to de-risk and incentivize private sector investments in climate adaptation. And we're so many ways you could talk about, whether it's climate finance, ag finance, water finance, climate gender equity finance. We're doing this across so many sectors. We recently just launched with Norway and are inviting others to join us what we're calling First Loss Fund. It's a fund of funds that seeks to invest in agri-food systems on the African continent. It is really focused on supporting the small and medium enterprises in the food system that are the backbone of the ag economy there, and which is highly undercapitalized. And we aim to leverage as much as $5 in private capital for every dollar we invest. And those investments will be made both through a gender lens and through a climate lens. And so that's an example of sort of finance through a very sector specific thing. But we're also doing some amazing work on the ground through crowding in investment in what we call nature-based solutions, which we think are really important. In Peru, we worked with government, water utilities in the private sector to crowd in $300 million of investment to restore watersheds and invest in green infrastructure upstream from the urban centers who require the water. That's delivering some really important results. 20,000 hectares of land restored, more than 3 million days of paid labor created, and of course, the sustainable water access in the urban areas. So again, looking for those multiple wins for people and planet.
All right. So I'm really encouraged that Battelle is doing this conference. A lot of it focus is on adaptation and resilience. There aren't a lot of those conferences yet. So it's exciting that they're focusing on this. And you had mentioned in your speech, too, that adaptation certainly hasn't got enough attention, maybe on as much as mitigation, but there's reasons for that. But I'm encouraged that we hear more about adaptation. So what messages or next steps you hope participants at this conference take away from this?
Well, you're right about the adaptation agenda. We are really excited that Boston Consulting Group did release a report just last year that notes that for every dollar a company invests in implementing adaptation and resilience, that can yield $2 to $15 in financial benefits. So the actual business case for adaptation is coming along, and that's very exciting. In terms of what I hope folks will take away, we know that progress is possible. So we need to come at this with a real solution-oriented, I think, approach. We see it in our own countries, and we see it in the places that aid works. We know, though, if we're going to accelerate change, we need to break down our own silos and institutional barriers between sectors like food and agriculture and climate. Those groups don't talk to each other as much as they need to, though that's beginning to change, between research and implementation, between public and private, international and local. And I think I said in my speech, sometimes we really need to think outside the box and bring different peoples and different skill sets together to bridge the gap between what's possible technologically and what people really want, what's desirable, achievable, and sustainably locally. And I hope people will come away with that question always in the forefront of their mind. Who benefits from what we do? Are we addressing the needs of those most impacted by a changing climate? That includes women, the extreme poor, the rural smallholder farmers, and indigenous communities. If we're not, then are the ways that innovation, new partnerships, new policies and approaches, what are those things that we need to do to get there?
Thanks for coming on the podcast, and thanks for the work you're doing.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Lauren Reese. Lauren is the Program Director of the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. Hi, Lauren. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for hosting me.
This is post-conference, and Wilson Center was a partner to Battelle. But first off, for my listeners, what is the Wilson Center? What do you guys do there?
Sure. The Wilson Center is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. What sets us apart from other think tanks you might have heard of is that we are congressionally mandated. So we are a living memorial to President Wilson, only president to have a PhD. So our mandate is to bridge policy, practice, and research. We have a number of different programs that focus on every corner of the globe, and then programs that look at emerging issues and key challenges facing foreign policy today.
I've gone to some of your events and I know all about you, but I did not know about the congressionally mandated part of that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, the key part of that is that we are strictly nonpartisan and non-advocacy. So we're often seen as a very safe space for having challenging conversations and across the aisle discussions that hopefully advance good policies.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there as the director of the Environmental Change Program?
Sure. We are focused on connecting the intersection of environmental change, climate change, population dynamics, and security to foreign policy and international development. So we really sit at this intersection of issues that most institutions and agencies and bureaus aren't set up to deal with. So looking across natural resources, human sort of population dynamics, where we're seeing population growth, where we see aging populations, what this means for a world on the move in terms of migration, and how these issues intersect with security, both hard security, so thinking about sort of military DoD, as well as human security, people's ability to access the food and livelihoods and water and other basic essential services that they need.
I've been covering it more in the national security scene. They're really getting into the climate resilience space big time. And as you just described, that's some of the areas that you do. Any other kind of programmatic things that you want to share that with the Battelle conference, it was a focus on resilience?
Yeah, our whole sort of premise is trying to move to a resilient world. And that means not just like snapping back to what was, but really looking forward and thinking about how both climate change, but also we're in a different population moment than we've ever been in before. We have aging populations in the US, in Europe, in much of Asia. We have continued growth in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. So what is this going to mean for global stability, the global economy, and how do we make sure that policies that we're putting in place today are going to continue to benefit us 10, 20, 30 years down the line? And a big piece of that is integrating environmental considerations, right? How are we accessing the resources we need? How are we thinking about a circular economy? Like, how are we building into our systems today sustainable and resilient policies that sort of recognize the fragility of ecosystems, the fragility of our planet, and the needs of people on the ground?
You partnered with Battelle in this conference. Can you tell us a little bit of the history there? Why did the Wilson Center do this in the first place?
It was a really wonderful partnership, right? Battelle manages a number of national laboratories. Their technological expertise, their understanding of the science was really a really nice complement to the work that we're doing at the Wilson Center, where we want to be bringing in that deep awareness of emerging technologies and innovations into policy considerations, into our understanding of how these kinds of advances can impact communities on the ground for hopefully for better, right? But there are also unintended consequences that come when you're introducing sort of new technologies and innovations. And so wanting to be able to consider those risks as we move forward. The Wilson Center, I think for Battelle, the Wilson Center has really robust policy outreach, right? Where we are in a position to engage meaningfully with decision makers, whether it's in Congress or in the administration across DC, but also internationally. And so being able to marry the research and innovation being done by Battelle and their partners with the policy community is what we were aiming to do.
You had a very specific role at ICR24. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yes. I think my goal was to work with colleagues at the Wilson Center to bring in the sort of policy relevant voices to the discussion so that the Battelle attendees could hear firsthand from administration officials. We had the Brazilian ambassador to the U.S. and broadening the lens with which we're thinking about climate resilience and that engagement with government policies. You want that sort of mutually beneficial relationship between government investments and policies that are driving innovation and innovations that are really feeding back into the decision making being done in Washington and elsewhere. And I had the opportunity to be the puppet master holding the strings that first morning, focused on that policy space and having the opportunity to welcome some of these real leading thinkers to the stage to introduce their own remarks. So that was a privilege.
At the conference, what were some of the highlights for you? And I guess specifically, we saw these different speakers, and I know you're not going to play favorites and you can't say all their names, but just give us some highlights of the event for you.
Sure. The opening was kicked off by Dr. Vinson, the president of Howard University. And I thought that was a really powerful representation of the importance of education, the importance of thinking about the future of the workforce and how are we building the skills and sort of education into universities and elsewhere today that are these are going to be the leaders 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And so what skill sets do we need to be developing today to really get ourselves where we want to be? And Dr. Vinson had some really poignant remarks, right? And one of them was the importance of pairing innovative research in climate resilience with environmental justice. And so thinking about that integration of a justice and equity lens, I think that came out in his remarks as well as some of the other speakers that we heard from. We had Sarah Ladislaw, the Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the National Security Council, and she really highlighted the point that preparedness pays. We can't have economic resilience without climate resilience. And that was a theme that we heard across the panel. We had a former Congresswoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from Florida, and I think she really articulated the importance of engaging at the local level. We have local communities who have their own sort of ideas of resilience. They have their own innovative solutions that could be scaled up, but they need the support. And so really making sure that engagement that starts at the local level. And I think we heard that also from Dina Esposito from the U.S. Agency for International Development, who's leading that community-led lens at the international level.
I got to meet briefly backstage the representative from Florida, and I told her I was from Sarasota, Florida, and she just gave me a hug and she says, we got to stick together. So
she was wonderful. She brought such good energy. Yeah.
Oh, she did. She did. So this is exciting for me. You guys have your own podcast there. Could you give us just maybe my listeners want to start listening to it? Can you give a plug to it? What you guys cover?
Sure. Yeah. So the New Security Broadcast, we cover a whole range of issues, right? If you're thinking about how big the buckets are of that intersection of issues that we're working on. But our primary goal is to bring underrepresented voices to a DC audience, but also more broadly, right? We have that sort of international outreach, but we recognize that the platform we have here in DC is a really privileged place to be. And we want to be able to leverage it to bring in sort of experts, people who are doing the work on the ground, doing the cutting edge research, bring them to a more sort of policy relevant and international stage. And so we're always looking for people who are interested to share what they're learning, share the work that they're doing on the ground that is yielding really important lessons learned. And so we cover a range of issues. And I welcome anybody to reach out to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org if you have a pitch.
On that note, just I guess a final pitch for the Wilson Center. You guys do webinars, you do events there. If people want to learn more or participate, what do you recommend they do?
You could go to wilsoncenter.org. We have all of the upcoming events, many of which are hybrid, so you're able to join remotely. And then a number of the programs, you'll find all of their some blogs and anything relevant to some of the key issues today, you'll be able to find there on the website.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Lauren, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Matt Huddleston. Matt is the Senior Climate Resilience Consultant at Resilient Analytics. Hi, Matt. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
First off, can you tell my listeners what is Resilient Analytics?
Yeah, so we are a company based out of Denver, Colorado, and what we look at is, as the name implies, climate resilience, and we do that through an analytical lens. And all of what we're looking at is based on engineering principles, and we pair those with climate data, so publicly available climate data that varies by where we are in the US or where we are in the world. But generally, we pair engineering strategy and design principles with that data to figure out what climate impacts might exist and what the cost to adapt to those impacts will be.
What do you do specifically there?
As a small company, we all wear a lot of hats, but my general role is running our projects while also getting in the weeds on the technical side for a specific number of our concentration areas. So my background's in civil engineering, and I have 7 years of experience as a mechanical engineer, also doing building design. So all of the built environment work that we do, I lead, and I'm on the technical side there as well as the project management side for a lot of our projects.
We're doing this interview post-conference, but what brought you to ICR24?
Obviously, we focus a lot in climate resilience and just climate change in general. And we always look to learn what is going on. What are the biggest innovations in the adaptation space? And I attended ICR last year, so in 2023 in Columbus, and there was just so much knowledge there with the different national labs and research that is being done. And even as we are in the private sector, a lot of great information being shared. And so it's just a great conference, I think, to learn the cutting edge as far as climate change adaptation. And so I'm hoping that this will be an annual thing that we'll attend and stay on that cutting edge and share where we're at.
So you did a poster there, and it was a great poster presentation, a bunch of posters. Tell us a bit about what the content of that poster was.
I was sharing a project that we recently completed, or actually a series of 2 projects that we recently completed, both focusing on a wide swath of adaptation costs. So when I say that, we looked at a lot of different sectors, so specifically 14 different impact areas. And our goal was to figure out the adaptation costs associated with climate change in these 2 locations. So the portion of the project that I highlighted in my poster was the building energy impact that we assess both for Wisconsin and for Los Angeles. And so our focus here is to quantify how much it'll cost in the future for buildings in those two locations to operate their cooling systems, their heating systems, and what's the net cost, so cooling plus heating. And so the way that we did this was we paired building inventory data set for both locations with climate projection data and energy model data that came from the Department of Energy's representative building energy models that are available. Any building in the building stock, there was a variety of building types, things like offices and things like public housing. All of them were public buildings, so owned by either a municipality, county, state, or federal government. And what we did was run those buildings through that energy model with future climate scenarios being used instead of historical TMY data that's typically used in energy model runs to figure out what cooling and heating costs might look like in the future. And the idea here is that we get a cost of, the way I like to look at it is an adaptation cost that is essentially how much do we have to spend in the case of cooling, or how much do we avoid spending in the case of heating to keep our building where it was designed to be as far as the internal temperature goes. And so that delta in cost, it was the final result. And it's interesting because when you compare a cooling dominated climate like Los Angeles with a heating dominated climate like Wisconsin, the results from a net perspective are vastly different. So you save quite a bit in heating costs over a year in Wisconsin in 2040 and 2060, whereas in Los Angeles, you don't necessarily. And so that comparison was a big takeaway, that in Los Angeles, the percentage costs go up quite a bit more than you do see in Wisconsin on a net basis.
It was interesting, and it was two very different locations too, Wisconsin and then Los Angeles. Now, I've been focusing on climate modeling a bit more on the podcast, and so you guys do that. Let's say you work with a municipality or a state government, and you're doing this number crunching, and you give them these projections, and you give them this information in theory that they're going to make some sort of policy decision on. You give them a projection, and it's your best projection, and obviously you're using the type of modeling data that you think is the most up-to-date and most accurate, but things change. And 10 years from now, some of this climate modeling data just might be junk. Not because anyone did anything wrong, it's just there's new computers or the projections are just accelerating. What's your relationship as a sort of a private entity with, they're using information that you gave them at a certain point in time, but those things could change radically. Do you guys have a sort of a situation where you deal with that?
Yeah, so the data that we're using, as I touched on earlier, so specifically for these projects, was LOCA CMIP 6 data, which in simple terms is just the most recent and finest scale publicly available climate data that's published by academic institutions globally and downscaled by a group out of San Diego. We use the best available data. We have a climate scientist on our team that evaluates this, and we've looked at this versus past releases to figure out, are these things changing a bunch based on our understanding and the most recent developments? And so far, these seem to be tracking well with what we're seeing in reality. And we look at how these model historic conditions as well. And that's a way that we can validate these models against, if we input historic conditions into the model, do we output what we saw, but based on historical monitored data? And so we take all the necessary precautions, but at the same time voice that there's definitely uncertainty and spread of possible outcomes here. And so we just try and make sure that the output states that and understand, and the clients that we work with understand that.
Could you give me some highlights from the conference for you, just the experiences and maybe just a speaker that really stood out for you?
Yeah, in general, it's just great. I always really enjoy stepping back getting out of the weeds for a little bit as far as project delivery and technical development, and stepping back and seeing where the state of the art is in this exciting area. It's such a necessary area, and it's always refreshing to see and hear other people's perspectives and meet such interesting people out there. And I think as far as one of my favorite talks was one that I think you were actually at as well, was Monica Serrano from Turner Construction, who I'm very familiar, as I said, my background's in the built environment and design for the built environment. And so I'm very familiar with how that industry works. And it's just exciting to see the steps that a company like Turner are taking in the resiliency space, because I think there isn't a ton being done at the moment. And so it's just exciting to see that people are starting to pay more attention to this resiliency thing, as opposed to the very important mitigation side, but we're starting to see the impacts are going to happen anyway. And so it's just exciting to see that things are being done and Turner's leading with that innovation.
If people want to learn more about what you guys are doing, what do you recommend?
Yeah, so you can we have a LinkedIn page, Resilient Analytics, and you can visit our website, resilientanalytics.com, or reach out to me on LinkedIn or email, and happy to share more. And I think you can also find our poster on the Innovations in Climate Resilience website, and that has a link to even more studies that go into more details on what we've talked about.
All right, Matt, it was nice meeting you at the conference. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, Adapters, joining me is Dr. Nadia Cedarum. Nadia is a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University's Climate School. She received her PhD in Earth System Sciences at Florida International University, where she researched the dynamic long-term impacts of sea level rise on coastal communities and their implications for future climate-related migration. Hi, Nadia. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
So where are you based?
Right now, I am actually based out of Washington, D.C., though I still work for the Climate School.
You were here to talk about the Battelle ICR24 conference, but let's just learn a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a bit about your research? You've shared some of this stuff with me, but just more broadly, what are you researching?
Yeah, right now at the Climate School, I am applying a multi-sectoral approach to really understanding, what are the policy solutions and tensions that exist in trying to scale climate resilient housing. The reason I do that and say that is because my research, in Miami-Dade really led me to the conclusion that even if climate migration is very much a real concern right now, it is slowly reshaping people's decisions to move in the future. But when I asked people, where would you move if you had to move, especially folks in Florida, they pretty much just picked another part of Florida. Most people wanted to move to Central Florida or North Florida, sometimes just the next county up. And so that really got me thinking that we need to find ways to build more climate resilient housing in this country, especially given the fact that we actually have to build more housing. The nation is undersupplied at anywhere between 3.8 to 10 million housing units, depending on what estimate you use. And if we're going to be building all this new housing, how can we make sure that it's safe and it will last with increasing climate impacts, be it from increased flooding or wildfire or sea level rise? What does it look like to actually build that housing? And that requires really an approach that takes a look at all the different actors that are actually involved in producing any single unit of housing. And that stretches all the way from local government to insurance companies to mortgage lenders to architects to urban planners. So it's been a really fun study in some ways, but it also has revealed so many tensions that exist across these sectors. And so what we're really hoping to do is try to figure out what are those pressure points and are there solutions that exist now to start to build collaboration in order to scale climate resilient housing.
Fantastic. Very important research. What brought you to ICR24? And we are recording this after the conference, so we can get your thoughts on it. But what brought you there in the first place?
Well, Doug, actually, it was you. I remember hearing about this conference on the America Adapts podcast, and I thought to myself, why didn't I go to this? And so I kept it in mind for this year, and I took a look, and I love that the theme was really integrating across both mitigation and adaptation with this focus on bringing resilience, that there would be many different people there from across government, policy, private sector folks. And when I saw that, I knew I had to be there.
All right. Fantastic. Totally forgot about that. I'm just not feeding you lines there. So that's great. Okay. So you talked about why you came in the first place, but share some highlights. So we were all wandering around a bit. What were some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, I think for me, the highlights were really some of the insights that some of the private sector folks had. As I've been working in this multi-sectoral space and interviewing people across insurance and housing finance, it's been really interesting to understand how they think about scientific models, how they think about the science and the work that we do. And so the private sector panel in particular was, again, just another great, I just feel like we, and as academics, don't often have insight into how the private sector is using our work or how they're thinking about our science or how we can collaborate in really interesting ways. And so it was really great to see that panel in particular, especially all of the innovation that they're trying to catalyze, and really even having some of the panelists speak to what, as scientists, what can we do to help those initiatives.
You are in the thick of doing research, and it looks like the applied nature of what you're doing will just go on for decades. Is there anything that is related to your research or any takeaways that you're like, all right, I'm going to explore this, or just even contacts or names? How is a conference going to be useful to you after the fact?
I'm really inspired by Tailwind's work, and mostly because as an adaptation scientist, personally, I think that there is not enough innovation in the field of adaptation. And what I mean by that is not necessarily on the technology side, but even from my own research. Again, I mentioned this sort of multi-sectoral study investigating what are the real tensions in scaling climate resilient housing. It turns out, and just again, as an initial preview of the work, a lot of the tensions that we have are actually within this space of the governance structures, the regulatory environment, the sort of socio-political conflicts that really exist. It's not necessarily the technological. So I'm really interested in thinking about those particular facets of the adaptation question, particularly as it relates to even private sector innovation. For example, even if we have technology, how can we implement it in certain ways? A really prime example that I have is floating houses. They seem like a great solution, right, to some of these pressing questions of increased flooding and sea level rise. But from my own research, what I found is the reason those structures aren't more readily, why we don't have more floating houses or why we don't see that solution being implemented at scale is, again, the lack of the regulatory environment, the governance structures that really exist to make that technology, to enable that technology.
Fantastic. And listen, I have my own agenda here. And how important is it to have an adaptation or resilience themed conference? There aren't actually a lot of them. And this is the third year that Battelle is doing it. And I just want to encourage them that they are planning an ICR25, but just we don't really have a lot of these conferences to go to that really focus on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I would agree with you. There aren't enough conferences that feature this work, especially as a centerpiece of it. Usually when I go to conferences, it's mainly a physical science conference that has some adaptation work. Adaptation is both a problem of any kind of adaptation work needs to blend both the physical impacts of climate change with with solutions for society. And we can't just continue to have conferences where that's just one or two panels. I really like that adaptation features very heavily at this conference, and we definitely need more of that.
All right, Nadia, it's been a pleasure having you on. But if people want to learn more, let's say there's adaptation planners out there, want to learn more about your important work, any information, I'll have some links in my show notes, but any advice to them if they want to learn more or get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can absolutely email me. I'm happy to share my knowledge. At the moment, all of the work that I described is still on. We're still actively analyzing and getting things ready for peer review, but we'll have it out as soon as we can.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Nadia. It was a pleasure meeting you at the conference, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Emily Mazzacrati. Emily's the co-founder of Tailwind. Hi, Emily. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
It was fantastic seeing you at ICR24, and I got you on. This is post-conference, but I want to bring you on and tell us a little bit. Tailwind has been on before with Katie McDonald, but again, could you just say what you guys do there at Tailwind?
Of course. So Tailwind is an innovation studio focused on accelerating the development and the deployment of adaptation and resilience solutions. So in plain English, that means we do two things. One is we're an early stage investor in adaptation and resilience tech startups, and we're an ecosystem developer. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what is going to help this market mature and flourish, and then we make it happen. So to give you an example, we're about to publish a detailed taxonomy of investment opportunities in adaptation and resilience. And we do a lot of work directly with early movers, with investors, with foundations, with innovators to help connect the dots between supply and demand.
Why would you make all that information public? So you want everyone to know about this? Sometimes it's like, all right, no, this is inside information. What was that dynamic? Is that you feel like this should be public information?
Absolutely. We think there should be a lot of investors. We think we should see a lot more corporations buying products and services. We should see the government procuring a lot of solutions. And so a lot of the work that we do is education. We want friends to play with. You can't do this alone, right? You can't be like the lone fund. And there are a few funds out there. You need a lot of startups. You need a lot of investments. At the end of the day, we're fundamentally mission driven. And so having a fund is one way to help the market. The priority for us is not to make money, but to make sure that we have better ways to prepare for the impacts of climate change.
What brought you to ICR24?
I was excited to find out what was going on, both from a policy standpoint. There was a lot of high-level policymakers, but also to see the work that was going on in national labs and folks who are more behind the scene and spend a lot of time thinking about those issues. And there were some great takeaways from the event. So it was exciting to see how much of a priority it is for a number of agencies in the federal government, seeing Department of Defense, but also the White House and NOAA and other agencies. The government's going to be a really big buyer of adaptation and resilience technologies. So that's going to be a big market driver. And the national federal government can also play a big role in subsidizing research and development and de-risking early stage technologies, which we absolutely need right now. And we want the government to build resilience for just everybody's benefits, right?
You gave us the reasons why you came there. Can you give us some highlights? Were there some particular people that you met or some sessions that really stood out for you?
Yeah, I mentioned national labs, and it was great to see the engagement and see some of the research that's happening there. I've been working on climate data and climate risk for a very long time, over 12 years. So it's exciting to see the progress that we're making in modeling climate change, in making the data as granular as we can, spatially and temporally, making it accessible to users, new planning tools. And there was a great panel by my co-founder, Katie McDonald, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit.
That's my next question. So you guys did this panel there, and yeah, Katie moderated it. Tell us a bit about that. Who was on the panel and what was the purpose of it?
So that was a great panel. Katie McDonald, co-founder, managing partner of Tailwind, was moderating. We also had Alex LaPlaza from Kettle. We had Sonam Belani from Streetlight Ventures. And then we had Julia Kumar-Drapkin from IC Change. So we had actual people who are entrepreneurs and investors. It was a very high energy panel, not just because everybody are rock stars on this panel, but because it was boots on the ground, real life experience of deploying adaptation and resilience solutions, of trying to solve problems, seeing what's working and what's changing life and what's holding back investments, and how do we find workarounds for these issues. And I think what was also very energizing is that everybody walked out of the room with their to-do list to support innovators and entrepreneurs in the space. And so how do we find ways to test solutions alongside community so we can see what works and what's impactful? How public funding can really help. There's a ton of money being deployed across the US right now around climate, and a lot of it is not particularly labeled or dedicated to adaptation and resilience, but there are ways to make sure that you bake adaptation and resilience in how this money is spent, and that's really key. And then the fact that we need creative, impact-driven investors, we need philanthropy, government, and the private sector working together to build a capital stack that really serves adaptation and resilience.
All right, just some feedback. I thought it was fantastic. I'm guilty as the next person. If a panel starts to slow down, out comes the phone, but I was riveted. And it was just, I've been doing this for 20 years, and it was just great to see just this new energy, new blood in this space in finance and venture capital and just a lot of things you haven't seen at a lot of previous adaptation themed conferences and summits. And so just some feedback. It was just fantastic. It was, I think we're going to see a lot more of these things. You guys are obviously being a leader in this space. And it was just great. The things that they were saying, these people were getting it really quickly. So yeah, it was fantastic.
Glad you enjoyed it. I thought it was great too.
Matt Vaughn from Battelle, and he started off this episode. He gave a plug to you guys during his opening remarks, and I asked him about that. And he said he did it because he wanted to just note that, as you just described, you guys are in this finance tech sector, and we're not seeing a lot of that. And so it's this new emerging area. So why do you think it's taken so long for what you guys are doing to get showing up in this place? And that's not so much about you guys, but I'm just saying I've been doing this for a long time. And it just seems like in the last couple of years, it's really ramping up. And I think that's such an encouraging sign.
It is very encouraging and absolutely delighted to be called out by Matt and the Battelle team. I also want to say there should be a lot more of us at this kind of events. And the onus is on both the organizers and speakers to think about what organizations like ours that speak both public and private speak should be in the room. There's usually a panel or two on climate risk and adaptation in most climate events nowadays, even if they're not dedicated to that. So there are opportunities to have more of a dialogue. That's the sort of the gap we're trying to fill in with Tailwind, is showing that there are opportunities to do well while doing good in adaptation and resilience specifically.
If people want to learn more about what you guys are up to, I'm saying you just have a website, but you guys are in the thick of partnering with relevant entities, right?
Yeah, we do a lot of work with partners. Everything's going to be on our website. That's tailwindclimate.com, one word. We're at a lot of conferences. We have a very active calendar of events, and that's a great way to connect with us. And there's going to be a lot of publications. I think the space is going to keep growing, and hopefully Tailwind will be one of many very soon because it will be such a big market. You won't even remember who we are.
Well, I doubt that. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming on the podcast and for what you're doing.
Thank you, Doug. My pleasure.
Hey, Adapters. I'm back, and I'm with
Taylor Dimsdale.
All right, Taylor, you were on last year at ICR23, and I've got you back on for ICR24. But remind us, who are you with?
With Forsmarsh, which is Behavioral and Social Science Research and Communications B Corporation.
So you are here doing a poster presentation. What is that about?
We basically wanted to do a study to see whether resilience, so that is communities that are more resilient to climate and disasters, help make climate and disaster risk less of a turnoff to homebuyers. So there's evidence that climate risk and disaster risk is influencing house prices. Some of the riskiest cities in terms of flood, wildfires, and hurricanes, for example, see home prices grow more slowly than the national average. There's evidence that agricultural land markets are pricing in heat risk. And just through surveys, we know that Americans report that they would be very hesitant to buy a house in an area that is very high risk of disasters. So we wanted to see if the same was true of resilience. So in other words, if you looked at two counties that were very similar socioeconomically, both facing a high risk of disasters, our hypothesis was that the more resilient county should see stronger economic growth in terms of things like prices, home prices, population, housing density, those kinds of outcomes. So that was the study that we wanted to do. Is sort of, there wasn't much of an evidence base on whether people value resilience in that context. We were surprised to find that there is a premium on resilience across the board, regardless of the level of risk, but it's relatively small when disaster risk is very high in those areas. It's actually much stronger in areas where disaster risk is low. So in other words, it seems that people value resilience more the lower the risk, which is a counterintuitive finding, something that we weren't expecting.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit, though. Maybe just by default, those people living in lower risk areas are more sensitive and more thoughtful about those climate risks, so they're not ending up in the first place. They're probably worried about something they don't have to, but that's who they are, maybe?
That's very possible. So that's one explanation. To be upfront, we can't say, of course, with any certainty why we found those results. That's going to require some additional research, which of course we would love to do. We speculate a little bit. So one possibility is just human bias. So we know people are bad at judging risk. It stands to reason they might be bad at judging the value of resilience as well. And we know, for example, that when risk gets very high, at some point people just start to tune out. Essentially, any marginal increase above a certain level of risk is discounted almost to zero. So it stands to reason that it's possible that if risk gets very high, people also start to discount any sort of value of resilience that they would otherwise see, in which case you would see resilience was less valued in very high risk areas. That's one possibility. Another is that, and I think this speaks a bit to what you were saying, the people who care most about risk also care most about resilience. In other words, you could have a group of people who are very concerned about climate risk. They want to live in the areas with the lowest climate and disaster risk that are also highly resilient. So they want to live in low risk, highly resilient areas because that maximizes their sense of safety, essentially. That's a possibility. A third possibility is that more resilient areas essentially means that your housing stock is better protected. So a disaster hits, the housing supply doesn't drop as fast as it would in a less resilient area. In that case, prices could still drop even if resilience was highly valued. So that's also a possibility. But we don't know. We need to do some additional research and I think actually go and talk to some of these people to find out how they think about resilience. Do they think about it at all? If so, in what context? Are there specific risks that they're thinking about, others that maybe they're not? So I think without some additional focus group research or qualitative research where we're having conversations with some of these people who are making that decision, it's difficult to say for sure why we're getting that result.
Is there just enough areas out there that you would classify that are factoring resilience into this whole area? I mean, that must be hard to find a community that you think is thinking about resilience.
The data that we used is from something called the BRIC, which is the University of South Carolina does a resilience index that's made up of various different indicators. So some are economic, some are social based, the strength of social networks, for example, in a community. Some are based on infrastructure, what kind of building codes are implemented. Some are institutional and governance related, and some are geographic. So do you have the right natural resources to be resilient? Do you have enough fresh water? So they aggregate all of these different indicators. I think it's something like 40, and they give communities a resilient score. So that's what we're going off of when we say a community is resilient. It has a high resilience score based on this index. Another possibility is that index, while useful, is not necessarily measuring what you might call true disaster resilience. It's possible it's not picking up on certain specific local circumstances that would make a place. Resilience is a complicated, sort of a complex thing. And so it's possible that the index is missing. One thing that's interesting in the study is we looked at the specific sub-indicators to see if there was any difference in this outcome. So in other words, just looking at infrastructure as representative of resilience, or just looking at social networks as representative of resilience, the one sub-index that did what we expected, in other words, where high-risk areas had valued resilience the most, was the natural resources index. You could say, well, maybe that's the true measure of resilience. Maybe to be resilient, the most important thing is that you have access to enough fresh water and you're sort of physically resilient from a geographic standpoint. But when we say resilience, that's the data we were using, is the score based on this index, which is what FEMA uses, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to program investment, to say, are there gaps? Does a community need better building codes, for example? Where are they relatively weak in terms of the investment and resilience?
Okay, I could see a situation where everything depends on just the indicators of what resilience is, and as you just described, but you could say I have a community that's doing a lot of great adaptation planning. It's like, all right, they're trying to become more resilient. And you could see a situation, let's say like Miami. They're very vocal and they're very they're very ambitious with a lot of their adaptation planning, to their credit. But couldn't you have a situation where, like, the more resilient you become, that the false sense of, what's the expression? You might give people that live there the sense that the climate risk is now low because the resilience is so high, and a place like Miami is just screaming climate risk. And yet you could just give this sense that oh, look what we're doing, all these do you worry about that all of a sudden these resilience indicators are giving that false sense?
Yeah, a false sense of security. It's a great question. It's absolutely something that we've thought about that I think it's important to be aware of. There might be some places where people shouldn't live that are uninsurable, that the risk is just too high. I guess the perspective I take on it is people, as they should be, are free to move where they want. There are always going to be people who want to move to risky places, not because they are risky, but because they're beautiful. They're near the beach, or you're in a forest. It's a beautiful natural environment. That's always going to be very attractive to people. It's just human nature. People are always going to want to live there. So I think our interest is in making those risky places as resilient as they possibly can be. But you raise an important point, which is that you need to be aware of the degree of risk. And because at a certain point, it probably doesn't make sense for people to be living in a place that's going to be either underwater or where the fire risk is just so high that you're going to see repeated wildfires. But I think for most places, they're always going to be some attraction to living there. And so the question is, how do you make sure that you have these planning assumptions, that you're prepared, you're investing enough in resilience so that the people who are there are protected?
There's got to be some sort of bell curve for resilience and climate risk. At some point, the resilience, as the higher it goes, diminishing returns depending on how high the climate risk goes. So I'm sure there's going to be all sorts of interesting stuff, and it seems like what you guys would do. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing what you're doing. And if people wanted to learn more about what you guys are up to, is this kind of publicly accessible information?
Yes, it's a published paper, and there's a sort of sister study, you might say, called Risky Movers, which was looking at different types of people who've moved to the highest climate risk areas over the past year in the U.S., what they look like demographically, their sort of profile. That's all at www.forsmarsh.com.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Adapters, I'm back, and I'm with
Faith Qiang, winner of 2024 Battelle Climate Challenge.
Okay, so where are you from? And you're in high school, right?
Yes, I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I go to Princess Anne High School in the IB program.
What's the mascot there?
Oh, Cavaliers.
So you were here, you won this climate challenge. Congratulations. What was the title of the winning comp that you submitted?
The title was BioWatt, a biologic wave attenuator.
So I know it's very complex, it's very technical, but just give us the overview. What is it? What were you doing there?
So I was tackling two challenges mainly, which was shoreline erosion and the decrease in biodiversity of marine ecosystems, which are two issues that were very prevalent in my area of Virginia Beach. So the technology works by combining three technologies, which are biorock, wave attenuation, and reef symbiosis. So biorock works by using a very small volt, between 5 to 10 volts of electricity, and through the process of electrolysis, it pulls out calcium carbonate from the ocean and generates limestone on the metal reef itself. So you can attach seaside organisms such as corals and oysters onto this reef, and they will grow at rates of up to 10 times as fast and also thrive in adverse conditions, as we can see from ocean acidification and warming oceans. Now, these artificial reefs create a great environment that allow fish and seagrasses or whatever else is in that environment to thrive, and this will increase biodiversity. Now, to power the biorock structure and possible other sister reefs that it can be connected to, I added a wave attenuator / wave energy converter that takes the oscillating motion of the waves in the ocean and turns that actually into energy.
I was reading a little bit about this, but how does this play a role? Because we're going to have sea level rise with climate change. Tell us how it can help with that.
So sea level rise can't really be stopped, but how we can influence and impact the resiliency of our cities is by rebuilding our coastlines and ensuring that shoreline erosion is stopped. And the way that bio works is by decreasing the energy of the waves and making the water that hits the shore calmer. So this way it erodes less sand, and the beaches can also rebuild by the reefs, also taking in some of that wave energy. So then the water that does hit the coast is calm and doesn't take away any sand, rather replenishes sand back onto the beaches.
All right. So this is a pretty complex project that you've done. Congratulations. What inspired you? Now, is climate change play a part of your inspiration doing what you're doing here?
Climate change definitely plays a huge role and was one of the main driving factors of what I was doing. I was seeing how it impacted me locally and the people that I love, the community around me, the place that I grew up in, the Chesapeake Bay. And I think this all really started when I learned of the amazing capabilities of oysters, how they can filter water themselves. They can filter microplastics and also stop eutrophication due to filtering phosphates and nitrates. So I really wanted to expand on oysters and their restoration, and current restoration practices for oysters just were not cutting it. They were essentially a lot of times not the best way to spend your money, and I wanted to bring a solution, which was originally just biorock, into the Chesapeake Bay and have it revitalize oyster growth and ecosystems.
That's pretty remarkable. Okay, so you explain why you were inspired. Now we're here at the Battelle conference and they've given you this award. And I think they're really impressed with what you've done here. You've been at this conference. What stood out for you? Are you learning a lot?
I definitely am learning a lot. I think what stood out to me most was the amount of diversity that was brought in here between thought. There was a lot of policymakers, a lot of people that were advocating for climate justice, which I was really happy to see since it wasn't really into our discussion most for what was prevalent of what we can do in climate change between the scientists and the engineers, but now we're actually bringing in policy and we're working on the communication aspect, which is vital to actually putting our ideas into play.
10 years from now, 20 years from now, where do you see yourself? What kind of career do you want to do?
I definitely want to be an engineer. Engineering and solving problems was what inspired me first. And I also have a love of biochemistry. Chemistry was also It is my favorite science, and shout out to my AP Chem teacher, Mr. Gur, for inspiring me to go into chemistry. But I'm interested in the startup scene and engineering my own solutions, bring those to market. I love networking and communicating with other people, and I can definitely see myself being an engineer and entrepreneur.
That's so ambitious for your being in high school. That's fantastic. I'm very encouraged for the future. Any words of inspiration for other young people out there that want to get into adaptation?
Yes, definitely. A huge issue that I found when I first started was trying to find a mentor to back me on my idea. And I really thought I would be limited without a mentor at first. And this really halted me from trying. And I would encourage anyone that's cold emailing professors or trying to get help in their project, trying to get a mentor, that you don't actually need your mentor. And you should definitely branch out with your idea and try your hardest on your own first. There is so much that you can do on your own, even without a mentor. But you can continue searching for that mentor in the meantime. Just don't let anything stop you. There is no age that is too young to start advocacy in your community. And I know climate change and climate doomerism is becoming a huge, vast issue, that we see climate change as a huge issue with no end. And oh my gosh, we're all doomed and we're going to die. True to some extent, but there are many solutions if you just look around us. I know the press, the media doesn't publicize these solutions enough, but there is so much that you can do within your own community. I would encourage everyone to do their part.
Okay, last question. College is just right around the corner. You have some favorites that you're going to apply to?
I definitely have given thought into colleges, and I really love either Massachusetts or California. I've been looking into colleges for engineering, and I think the two things that matter to me most is that it's a great engineering college and they have a good startup scene, or they foster something interdisciplinary between entrepreneurship and sparking ideas, encouraging students to go on their own and explore pathways, research on their own, and also the science, the engineering aspect.
Stanford, MIT, I hope you're listening. All right. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the award. And I'm very optimistic about the future with people like you working on this subject.
Thank you so much.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to all the experts who appeared in this episode. As you can tell, ICR24 attracted top talent in the adaptation sector and some of the leading climate officials in the federal government. That was a first, talking with the head of NOAA. And that was my first interview with someone from USAID. I appreciate Dr. Spinrad and Dina Esposito for participating in this podcast. And I wanted to end the episode on a positive, uplifting note. And Faith Xing, the winner of Battelle's Climate Challenge, delivered and then some. Faith is doing great things. And can you imagine what she'll be doing in 10 years? I didn't even know what a startup was when I was in high school. But I am cautiously optimistic about the future when I know young future adaptation professionals like Faith are out there. It's also a treat to meet some of my listeners, some of whom traveled across the country to attend. Yes, Cassandra, excited you made the trip all the way from Seattle. I love connecting with my listeners, and those that attended this event come from such a diverse background, be it the private sector, academia, and also government. You guys are doing some amazing things out there in the adaptation space. And I also met quite a few new people doing a diversity of adaptation work across all sectors. You can also find resources for the conference on Battelle's website and a LinkedIn page they've created for ICR24. You can see speakers and attendees, and plenty of photos and videos of presentations should be available soon. Those links are in my show notes. I want to thank the team at Battelle for all the help they provided at the conference. Special shout out to Lisa Avedon from Battelle, who's my primary partner there. I've worked with Lisa on both ICR23 and now ICR24. And thanks to Battelle for their long-standing partnership and for sponsoring this episode. It's always a treat to work with Battelle. They connect me with some amazing leaders in the climate adaptation space, and I love sharing their stories with you. Hopefully I'll be back at ICR25, and maybe I'll meet some of you in person at that event. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.